As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, European governments were struggling to retain control over systems that had become overburdened in a number of ways. Some governments would collapse under their own weight. This is what happened in the East. Others would reassess, redistribute weight, lose a few pounds so that they could better provide the services that they had throughout the 20th century. This is what middle-way countries like Sweden ultimately did. Still others saw shifts in governance which seemed to turn away from most political givens, like an expanded welfare system, in order to survive. Let's start with the latter. In Britain, the expansive mid-century had seen the Labour and Conservative parties essentially trade rule, but when the 1970s oil crisis and the mining strikes hit, the British chose to stick with the party which had always provided, the Labour Party. However, the Labour governments of the mid and late 1970s did very little to alleviate the situation. Britain faced soaring inflation from about 5% at the start of the decade to a record 24% mid-decade and then back to about 17% at decade's end. And they had prolonged strikes over the winter of 1978 to 79, which then became known as the Winter of Discontent, which led to major union victories, which further undermined the profits of various employers. The business community was tired of Labour's concessions to workers, and all Britons tired of inflation. In the general election of 1979, Conservatives had won 44% of the vote, increasing their total seats by 62 and establishing a clear party majority. This meant that the Conservative Party's leader, Margaret Thatcher, became Prime Minister. She was the first woman to hold the post and would be the longest-serving Prime Minister in the 20th century. Unlike other conservatives, Thatcher explicitly rejected the sort of liberalism that had been embraced by all British political parties post-World War II, a liberalism which, for instance, embraced economic nationalization, that is, public ownership of industries, strong unions, and the regulation of a generous welfare state. Thatcher realized that her politics might be different from that of other conservatives, and she moved forward with her views. She said in 1979, just prior to the general election, "I am not a consensus politician. I am a conviction politician." What she meant by this embrace of what had become known as conviction politics is that she was campaigning based on her own fundamental values or ideas rather than attempting to represent an existing consensus or simply take positions that were popular in the polls. The resulting platform, which transformed British Conservative Party, came to be known as Thatcherism. For her uncompromising political stances and powerful leadership style, she was dubbed the Iron Lady by a Soviet journalist. Does the image on the right look familiar? That one of Thatcher on the stairs at 10 Downing Street? It should.
For our ass-kicking Prime Minister. I think he'll enjoy this. A golden oldie for a golden oldie.
Hold me. I'll give you all that you need. Wrap your love around me. You're so excited, I can feel you getting hotter. Oh baby, I'll take you down. I'll take you down. Where no one's ever gone before. And if you want more, if you want more, then jump for my love.
Hope y'all enjoyed that. Economically, Thatcherism brought an end to traditional British belief in the tenets of Keynesianism, which advocated government involvement in the business cycle, particularly in unemployment, through government spending and monetary policies like manipulating interest rates. Instead, Thatcherites believed that free markets should be the norm, and that government spending should be restrained. This meant that the government would move to privatize more than 50 businesses or industries during her tenure, including British Petroleum, British Telecommunications, British Gas, British Airways, British Steel, British Water, and, as a holdover just after she left power, British Electricity. Rather than stimulating the economy directly with government policy, Thatcherism called for watching and manipulating inflation rates rather than employment, which is often referred to as supply-side economics, which holds that the economy is best stimulated by reducing obstacles to business, so lowering corporate taxes, for example. The idea being that as businesses have the capital to expand, they will, thereby hiring new employees who will spend their money out in the economy and stimulating economic growth. Thatcher's administration also deregulated the British stock market in October of 1986, a move known as the Big Bang for its intense positive effect on the British economy. such that London became a global financial center. However, without government subsidies, some factories did close down, particularly in the North, and never reopened. The North grew progressively poorer than the South over time. Of course, restraining government spending had an effect on Britain's welfare system. In 2013, documents released from Downing Street about Thatcher's early years as Prime Minister reveal that initially, she and her cabinet had plans to quite significantly change the welfare system. Suddenly, there would be a charge for education and a scaling back of university tuition help, and, most jarring, the end of the beloved National Health Service, or the NHS. In 1982, a weakened version of this plan was leaked to the press, forcing Thatcher to promise that the NHS was in safe hands with the Conservative Party. All other aspects of the Britain's welfare system, however, was open to reform. The unions got the worst of the reforms. Strikes had to be determined by ballot majority, and if they weren't, then they were illegal strikes, and therefore a union's assets were at risk. A secondary picketing, when picketers appear outside a location secondary to the main one, for instance, if in picketing a particular coffee producer, some also picketed Starbucks for buying their coffee, a flying picketing, when mobile groups of protesters appeared at a primary location on very short notice, both of those picketing styles were outlawed. Eventually, Thatcher moved to reduce unemployment benefits and subsidies by taxing them, which further hampered the ability of some unemployed to gain employment. In the early 1980s, with 3 million Britons out of work and some of them rioting in the streets, Thatcher reached the first nadir of her career. And she was only saved by a conflict on the other side of the world. In May of 1982, the government of Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in an attempt to gain credibility domestically. These islands had been claimed by Britain since the 17th century and occupied by British settlers since the early 19th century. They'd been a crown colony since 1841, but Argentina had claimed control via Spain since the 18th century. The islands were retaken by the British after a short 10-week war, which increased British patriotism. It also, incidentally, increased Thatcher's standing since her son was fighting in the Falkland Islands action. And this helped to jumpstart the British economy. After the British victory, Parliament recognized the Falklanders as British citizens. It was after the Falkland Islands action that Thatcherism's social values were on display. She advocated a return to Victorian values. Her insistence that Britain was made up mostly of strongly patriotic, conservative Tory workers meant that her social policies often took on an us versus them aspect, where those who, as Thatcher believed, chose to revel in their laziness should be hated. This stance fanned social tensions in Britain. Yet, she sometimes supported unusual positions. As a member of Parliament in the 1960s, Thatcher had voted to legalize homosexuality and abortion. However, in 1988, her government enacted Section 28, a law which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality or its possibility as a, quote, pretended family relationship in schools. As a result of this law, LGBT support groups across Britain were dissolved as schools feared persecution from the government. In the late 1980s, after Thatcher's third term as Prime Minister began, Britons were becoming weary of her. She began to refer to herself in the royal we and became increasingly paranoid about party unity, routinely asking conservatives if they were one of us. Further, while as an MP Thatcher had fully supported Britain's joining the common market, as the move toward a European Union became inevitable, she dragged her feet, causing consternation among a Conservative Party largely in favor of the move, including adopting one common currency across Europe. Concerned that the Labour Party would revive because of anti-Thatcher feeling within the Conservative Party and with the British population, Conservatives replaced her with John Major in 1990. In 1982, now under the leadership of Helmut Kohl, Germany moved to counteract their stagnant economy. Kohl gained support from both the Free Democrats and the more conservative Christian Social Union. He cut taxes and reduced government spending by reducing welfare spending, freezing government wages, and cutting corporate taxes. Within 2 years, Germany's inflation rate had dropped significantly to 2%, and Germany had acquired a 10% share of world trade. Unlike Thatcher, however, Kohl was careful not to fan class or racial hatreds. In any case, the Nazi menace was still around, especially given the number of immigrants to Germany, many of them from very different ethnicities and religions. In 1981, socialist François Mitterrand was elected president of France. Stagflation had been so devastating that Mitterrand not only nationalized banks and certain industries, but unlike Kohl and Thatcher, stimulated the economy through government spending via wage increases and social spending. This was an unpopular move with the business community, who responded by investing their capital abroad. But since most ordinary French citizens kept their consumption domestically, that began to balance out the economic problem. In the 1986 elections, the National Assembly saw the rise of the conservative parties in France, forcing Mitterrand to appoint their leader, Jacques Chirac, a former mayor of Paris, as prime minister. Surprisingly, this partnership worked because both men shared similar views on foreign policy, and the efforts to compromise, in the end, promoted France's general interests. With these men working together, the French government began the task of balancing its economic policy between encouraging investment by cutting the costs of social programs and the commitment to social security programs. The balancing act worked. By 2000, France would have the most prosperous economy in Europe. At the same time, however, France often suffered from high unemployment given the business community's refusal to invest in new jobs which carried social security costs. As elsewhere, most notably Germany, the increasing numbers of immigrants in France also impeded a swift solution to the unemployment problem, and actually exacerbated ethnic and religious tensions. Most of the immigrants coming to France at this time came from former French colonies in Africa. Many spoke the language, but were culturally distinct. Political racism became increasingly popular from the mid-1980s onward, as immigrants proved a handy scapegoat for the high unemployment rate. In counterpoint, pro-tolerance groups like SOS Racism formed in France and across Europe to combat what many saw as an unnerving return to fascist-like nationalism. In addition, all Western countries saw the appearance of a new political party, the Greens. The Greens were militant environmentalists, angered by the deterioration of their environment. This party had opposed nuclear power even before the 1986 disaster at Chernobyl, and were more vociferously against it afterwards. In addition, they opposed the rampant tourism that often trashed national areas, especially when campers were involved. In some countries, concessions to the Green Party allowed for the cleanup of rivers. Even as countries dealt with economic blows, there was hope. In July of 1975, the representatives of 35 countries, all of Europe except for Albania and Andorra, but including the Vatican, along with the United States and Canada, met in Helsinki, Finland for the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the CSCE. It culminated a 2-year process beginning in 1973, during which these countries had developed a process by which relations might be improved between East and West, communist and anti-communist. The Helsinki Accords, or the Helsinki Final Act, capped stage 3 of this process, and while not binding because it's not a treaty, it did lay out a variety of principles guiding the rapprochement process, such as the recognition of sovereign equality, refraining from the use of threats or force, the inviolability of national borders, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the self-determination of peoples. Now, obviously, the adoption of these accords were momentous. In exchange for the Soviet Union's agreement to respect human rights and refrain from the use of force, Western nations recognized the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Both East and West agreed to consult in scientific matters. Was it possible that the 80s would see the definitive thaw in the Cold War? Well, thaw would be the wrong word to use, at least at first. Let's start explaining why with a look at Poland. In 1980, strikes and riots in protest of living conditions spread rapidly in Poland's industrial areas, particularly in the shipyards of the city of Gdansk. Solidarity, a new independent and illegal organization of trade unions, gained 10 million members. It was led by Lech Walesa, an electrician from Gdansk. The Catholic Church, now under the leadership of a Pole, who took the name John Paul II, helped Solidarity mobilize opposition to the Communist Party. Basically, Polish Catholic churches proved convenient fronts for political meetings of Solidarity, during which strategizing could occur. Priests and other clergy acted as lookouts. If it seemed that government officials were about to drop in, all they'd see was a group of adults meeting for prayer or Bible study. To try and stem the tide of liberalization, the Polish Communist Party agreed to tolerate the creation of new unions so long as they did not engage in political activity. So, labor unions could exist, but they couldn't be political. Right. In late 1980, the Communist Party forced Gierek to officially recognize Solidarity's existence. When Solidarity's members began calling for free elections, however, trouble ensued. To quell the rising calls for free elections, in December of 1981, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, the new head of state, instituted martial law and replaced communist officials with military officers. Solidarity was suspended, and its leaders, including Lech Walesa, were imprisoned. Catholic clergy and pro-Solidarity activists were targeted for assassinations, and in 1982, the government declared Solidarity completely illegal. It seemed that the Helsinki Accords' goal of recognizing self-determination was being ignored. We see something a little bit similar in East Germany. The German Democratic Republic's chief, Erich Honecker, who came to power in 1971, had proved incapable of change. In the 80s, the German Democratic Republic seemed stuck in the Cold War groove. Here, where Protestantism is the majority religion, the Lutheran Church provided a center for some dissidents, organizing prayers for peace in Leipzig. While less organized than the Catholic Church's support for Solidarity in Poland, the Lutheran churches nonetheless continued the trend of clergy helping to mobilize against communist regimes. In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu adopted national communism and a neutral stance towards several Soviet initiatives. This flew directly in the face of Romania's traditional role within the Warsaw Pact system. Ceausescu's government moved to stimulate industrial development against the Soviet order to focus on agricultural production. The results were disastrous. Romania needed enormous government investment in infrastructure which the Soviet Union had not provided and which Romania was ill-equipped to develop. Meanwhile, the people starved, and they began to criticize the government more forcefully. Romania, by the end of the 80s, had become the second poorest country in Europe, and Ceausescu's regime became increasingly more repressive. Now, given the Brezhnev Doctrine, you might think that the Soviet Union would be mobilizing to support the Polish and East German Communist parties to maintain control. Except Helsinki Accords and Afghanistan. In 1973, the Afghan monarchy had been overthrown. In 1978, the Communist Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was created. This country immediately signed a friendly treaty with the Soviet Union. This situation wasn't a surprise. Russia had been involved in Afghan politics since the 19th century, and the Soviet Union had sent billions of dollars in aid to Afghanistan since the 1950s. However, in February of 1979, the same month that the Iranian Revolution began, an anti-communist Afghan group that was against the new government kidnapped Adolph Dubs, the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. President Jimmy Carter, it turns out, was not having a good 1979. The United States immediately demanded that the Afghan government negotiate with the kidnappers, but the Afghan government refused. As a plan B, the U.S. sent its embassy staff and diplomats to try and negotiate Dubs' release. Now, at the same time that the U.S. was negotiating with the kidnappers, and unknown to the United States, the Afghan police, advised by Soviet agents, attempted to retrieve Dubs by force, but Dubs was killed in the crossfire. While Dubs' death understandably led to strain between the United States and Afghanistan. Well, by this point, the Afghan government was facing a civil war, as there were rebels dissatisfied with the Soviet influence in the government. The president of Afghanistan reached out to the Soviet Union, requesting military support against the rebels. Initially, the Soviets sent support disguised as technical advisors or bodyguards, but by the end of 1979, the Soviet Union sent in occupying forces. The Soviet-Afghan War had begun. This war pitted the Soviet-supported Afghan government against the Afghan rebels, called the Mujahideen. By the mid-1980s, the Mujahideen had broad support from other countries, the United States, the UK, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even the People's Republic of China. This support, in the form of money and armaments, as well as additional fighters from Muslim countries, contributed to the rising costs of the war for the Soviet Union. It was clear that the Soviet-supported government now had no easy path to victory, and that the Soviet Union had inserted itself in a situation that it actually knew very little about. For this reason, the Soviet-Afghan War is sometimes referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. For the Soviet Union, the fighting in Afghanistan further depressed an already struggling economy and further alienated the people from their government. Leonid Brezhnev had reinforced the powers of the Soviet bureaucracy through his catchphrase, "trust in cadres," and through the prestige of the KGB. In addition, he'd poured more money into the military, reflecting the renewed chill of the Cold War. But the commitment to the Helsinki Accords caused a fracture of the Brezhnev doctrine, and then Brezhnev died in 1982. His replacement, Yuri Andropov, was more liberal, enforcing mild reforms. But then he died suddenly in 1983 from a heart attack. The next leader, Konstantin Chernenko, was more of a Brezhnev man, but he was chronically ill already. And when he became leader, the Soviet state basically treaded water until his death in 1985. And so, in 1985, we finally come to Mikhail Gorbachev. While a party man, Gorbachev had experienced the harsher side of the Soviet regime. Both of his grandfathers had been arrested under false charges under Stalin. Gorbachev sought education to better his situation. In fact, he was the first Soviet leader since Lenin to have earned a university degree. He was a lawyer. He had entered the government the representative of a regional council and then secretary of the Supreme Soviet, the governing council of the USSR. In 1979, Gorbachev had been appointed to the Politburo, the Soviet Union's executive governing council, and he became a voting member of that body a year later. When he assumed the leadership of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was convinced that he had to deal with the remaining ghosts of the Stalinist regime, which he felt had ruined the communist dream. He believed that the reforms along the lines of the Prague Spring could and should come to Moscow, so long as the Communist Party continued to dominate political life in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev embraced the policy of liberation known as glasnost, openness in government combined with a greater degree of free expression. He demonstrated his commitment to openness by appointing some liberals, both communist and non-communist, in positions of responsibility, and he ordered the relaxation of censorship. This, unsurprisingly, brought forth sharp criticisms of the Soviet regime. Nonetheless, the openness continued. Given glasnost, it was inevitable that Gorbachev became aware of the unpopularity of the Afghan War. It was under Gorbachev that the Soviet Union began a slow drawing down of forces in Afghanistan, although they wouldn't leave the war until 1989. There were other clear signs of real rapprochement between East and West. For instance, only 3 days after it occurred, Gorbachev admitted to the nuclear explosion at Chernobyl in 1986, something that likely would never have happened under earlier premiers. The cleanup at Chernobyl would cost the Soviet Union about 18 billion rubles, which at that time was about $18 billion. It would virtually bankrupt the treasury. Some historians now consider Chernobyl a contributing factor in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as the satellite states, particularly Ukraine, in which Chernobyl was located, grew even more distrustful of the Soviet Union and, now protected by the policy of glasnost, began advocating for nationalistic changes. Gorbachev was also open to discussing the failure of past economic policies. However, he was convinced that communism could work if it was reformed to be rid of the inefficiency and brutality of the Stalinist system, which had, unfortunately, become institutionalized. Because agricultural collectivization, upon which the Stalinist system had been based, had failed, the Soviet Union needed a new system. Thus, Gorbachev introduced perestroika, a restructuring of the Soviet system meant to make it more efficient and responsive to the needs of the Soviet citizens. In 1987, Gorbachev reduced the role that state corporations played in the Soviet economy, paving the way for economic privatization, for the dreaded free market economy. In this, he was, consciously or not, following in the footsteps of Margaret Thatcher, whose privatization of industry had resulted in an economic boom for Great Britain. Gorbachev also encouraged foreign investment in the Soviet Union, inviting Western corporations to expand into the Union. In 1988, Gorbachev sponsored a series of political reforms. Anyone, even dissidents within or outside the Communist Party, could be elected to the Congress of People's Deputies. Further, He spoke of a thaw in Cold War relations, and he replaced the old foreign minister, a crony of Brezhnev's, with his old friend, Eduard Shevardnadze, a Georgian whom he'd known since his time in the Young Communists League. Still in all, these moves would prove too little too late, and the loosening of the reins merely allowed for the quicker breakdown of the Soviet regime and, through it, the fall of communism. As you'll see demonstrated in the next lesson, 3 factors converged in the late 1980s to bring about the fall of communism. The first factor is the momentum gained by the strong nationalist movements in the wake of Glasnost within various Soviet socialist republics, especially in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Moldavia, Armenia, and Ukraine. These movements were not pacified with just the easing of Russification. These countries wanted real freedom. The second factor is the democratic opposition to communism that had emerged, led in Russia by Andrei Sakharov, a Soviet hero who'd helped develop the hydrogen bomb. Gorbachev's encouragement of participation in public life led to a greater demand for reform. These democratic rebels had been vocal since the late 1970s and often criticized the regime on the basis of their non-compliance with the Helsinki Accords, and an alliance between Democrats and nationalists strengthened the calls for reform. The third factor was the economic crisis that emerged in 1988. As a result of the crisis, an increasing number of Soviet citizens became convinced that the communist government could not bring about a meaningful improvement in the quality of their lives. These Soviet citizens criticized the subsidies given to Eastern European satellite states, insisting that that money would have been better spent within Russia. Given the collapse of the Soviet economy, Gorbachev was forced to reassess some of the basic elements underscoring the Soviet system and the Cold War itself. For instance, the armed race could not continue. The Soviet Union simply didn't have the funds. Accordingly, Gorbachev moved to improve relations with the United States, resuming arms negotiations, but ultimately refusing to sign an agreement on those negotiations because President Reagan refused to include his Star Wars experiments in them. In 1988, the British pop group The Escape Club released the single Wild Wild West. Its lyrics celebrated the end of the decade, heading for the 90s, living in the Wild Wild West. In many ways, the song was a somewhat debauched celebration of Western 80s culture. The song alludes to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. While likely unintentional, this song isn't anywhere near as political as, say, the German band Nina's 1983 anti-war hit 99 Luftballons. The lyrics of Wild Wild West nonetheless make clear that the dichotomy between East and West had never been more stark. In the West, freedom ruled, and while some countries struggled economically, even the poorest citizens seemed to be living at a standard leaps and bounds above that of the poor in the East. The communist bloc's struggling economy added fodder to the fire of liberalism that had already begun to sweep through the satellite states. What could possibly happen next? Well, I'll leave you with this little nugget.